A moon bled its pale light through torn clouds, casting silver scars across the endless prairie. The land stretched empty, a sea of dust and grass that moved only when the wind carried it. And tonight the wind was restless, howling like a mother searching for her lost children. Along that barren plain, two small figures pressed forward, barefoot, their shadows thin as reeds, their steps hesitant, as though every grain of dirt cut into the soles of their feet. They were no older than 9, twins carved from the same sorrow. Their clothes were little more than rags, torn at the hem, stiff with dust, clinging to their frail forms. One held the other's hand so tightly that the knuckles whitened, as though letting go meant being swallowed by the darkness. Their whispers were soft, barely more than breaths caught in the wind, words meant to keep fear from devouring them whole. Keep walking. We can't stop. If we stop, he'll find us. The prairie gave them no comfort. Every rustle of grass was a threat. Every coyote cry from the far hills sounded like a cruel laugh. The night was not their friend, but neither was the day, for daylight only meant being easier to see, easier to drag back. So they moved when the stars burned and slept in fits of trembling silence when the sun rose. The marks of their past lay not in what could be seen, but in what could not be spoken. Their arms bore faint bruises, fading but not forgotten. Their thinness told the story of hunger that stretched longer than any child should know. And their eyes, too wide, too old for such small faces, spoke of abandonment, of cruelty pressed into them like a brand. The land had its scars. So did they. The first night they hid in a broken-down barn, tucking themselves into a pile of old hay that smelled of rot. Rats scurried around them, but they did not scream, only held each other tighter, whispering songs their mother once sang. By the second night, the barn was far behind, and they curled beneath a tangle of mesquite bushes, shivering against the cold. Hunger twisted their stomachs until sleep became impossible, so they gnawed on a crust of bread stolen days ago, dividing it evenly, each bite measured like gold. The third night, the bread was gone, and their legs trembled with every step, yet they dared not stop. Shadows chased them even when no man was near. Fourth night, their bodies began to give way. Their breaths came ragged, little whimpers breaking from their lips as they staggered across the prairie. The moon lit their path, cruel in its brightness, showing how small they truly were against the weight of the world. Still, they walked, because walking was all they had left. The girl with the weaker steps stumbled, nearly falling. Her sister caught her arm, whispering, "One more. Just one more hill. Maybe something waits for us." But the hills rolled on endlessly, and each crest led to another. Hope became as thin as their voices, but they clung to it, because children, even broken ones, cling harder than most. At last, through the haze of exhaustion, they saw it, a silhouette rising from the land like a memory carved into stone. A ranch, lonely, sprawling. The house standing broad and silent beneath the half-dead branches of cottonwoods. A windmill creaked faintly, turning against the dark. The place looked both abandoned and alive, as though it waited for someone to arrive. They slowed, dread fighting with relief. A house meant people. People meant danger. But it also meant warmth, maybe food, maybe rest. Their legs decided for them, stumbling forward without thought, their small hands locked together. From the shadows of the porch, a figure moved. He was enormous, tall as the doorway, shoulders wide enough to block the faint light behind him. The children froze, their breaths caught sharp in their throats. The man's presence filled the night like a storm. The moon touched the lines of his face, rugged, scarred by work and weather, a man shaped by the land itself. His silence was heavier than a shout, and to the twins, it felt like judgment. The weaker girl fell to her knees, and her sister bent with her. Holding her up, though, she swayed herself. The man stepped closer, his boots pressing into the dirt with a slow, deliberate sound that echoed in their bones. They flinched, trembling, their eyes wide as though expecting the strike that always came before. One of them, voice shaking like a dry leaf in the wind, whispered into the dust between them, her words a plea carved from pure fear and memory. "Please don't beat us. We are already injured." The silence that followed was endless. Then their small bodies gave way, collapsing in the dirt at the giant's boots, their fingers still locked together, as the night held its breath around them. Dawn spilled gold across the ranch, as though heaven itself had torn open for a moment, letting light pour into the broken world. The giant man moved slow across the yard, the weight of the two small bodies cradled in his arms, making his steps deliberate, careful, like a man carrying glass. Their hands dangled limp, fragile as fallen petals after rain, their faces slack with exhaustion. He lifted the latch with his shoulder and stepped into the silence of his home, the scent of wood smoke and old timber greeting him like an old friend who had forgotten how to speak. The house was large but lonely, its corners holding dust and its hearth long, unused. He laid the girls on a patched quilt spread across the couch, their breathing shallow, uneven. For long while he just stood over them, his massive frame bent as though unsure what to do with such smallness. His life had been nothing but cattle, fences, and the endless prairie. He knew the shape of storms, the patience of soil, the cruelty of drought. But he did not know the language of children anymore. Once long ago, he thought he would. That dream had died with the woman who carried his child, and with them, something in him had sealed itself shut. Since then he had spoken mostly to the land, and the land had replied in silence. When the girls stirred, they did not rise in trust. They woke like startled birds, flinching at the sound of his boots shifting on the floorboards. Their eyes darted toward him, wide with suspicion, then to the door as though measuring how far they'd need to run if his hand lifted. He did not move toward them. Instead, he turned, lit the stove, and began to cook. The smell of eggs and bread soon filled the room. They ate like sparrows, hands quick and guarded, stuffing food as if it might vanish. When his shadow stretched near the table, they bent their heads, waiting for the sharpness of anger that had once ruled their days. But none came. He simply filled their cups again with warm milk, then went outside to tend to the animals. When he returned hours later, he found the girls hiding beneath the bed, their thin legs trembling. He did not scold them. He left a small bundle on the floor, mended shoes, their seams uneven but sturdy. Then he walked away. Each day moved in this rhythm, the silence between them thick at first, then thinner, stretched like cloth softening with wear. He spoke rarely, his voice deep and steady, as if carved from stone. Instead, he let the work of his hand speak, a bowl of stew left steaming, a blanket laid closer to the fire, a doll carved from wood and set quietly on the windowsill. The twins began to watch him when they thought he was not looking. They saw how he paused before stepping inside, how he moved with a slowness that meant he was careful not to startle them. In town, whispers rose. The old storekeeper, a man with a back bent by years, leaned close as he measured sugar into a sack. Folks would start talking, he warned. A man like him, living alone with 2 children, it would not sit easy with others. The giant said little, only nodded, his eyes lowered, as though he had carried judgment before and would carry it again. The widow who lived on the edge of town offered help, but her words carried hooks. She smiled sweetly yet spoke loud enough for others to hear, wondering why a man so long alone suddenly wanted company, what secrets lingered on that ranch beyond the hills. Her eyes gleamed with curiosity disguised as kindness. Back at the ranch, the girls began to change in small ways. Their eating slowed, no longer desperate gulps, but tentative bites, their eyes flicking up to see if food remained. They slept deeper, though they still woke at the creak of his boots. And then came the afternoon when something shifted. He sat outside, knife in hand, carving wood with the patience of a man who knew how to pass time without rushing it. The curls of shavings fell into the dust at his feet, glinting in the sun. The twins approached, hesitant, each step like a question. In their small fists they held wildflowers, stems bent from being clutched too tightly. They stopped before him, their faces lifted, uncertain. He looked at them, not with surprise, but with the calm stillness that was his nature. Slowly, they placed the flowers into his palm, their tiny hands brushing the calluses of his fingers. No words passed. None were needed. The silence between them, once a wall, became a fragile bridge. That night, the house was not so empty. Firelight flickered across the walls as the girls curled together by the hearth, their breathing soft, steady, free from the whimpers that had haunted their sleep before. He sat in the shadows, watching them, his massive hands folded in his lap. For the first time in years, his lips moved in prayer, not the loud, certain kind, but a broken whisper of thanks and plea mingled together. The prairie outside lay vast and cold, but within those walls, something fragile had begun to take root. The giant did not smile, but the weight on his shoulders seemed lighter, as though the silence of his exile had finally been answered. The horizon darkened before the sun was done with the day. A strange color bled across the sky, copper and ash, the kind of light that made cattle restless and men uneasy. The wind rose, sharp and biting, tugging at loose boards and setting the windmill to moan. The giant rancher stood in the yard, his frame braced against the first push of the storm. Behind him, tumbleweeds spun and broke against the fence line. He turned, sharp-eyed, and called the girls inside with a low, steady voice. They hurried, skirts whipping, hair in their eyes, and he shut the door behind them as if sealing the house from more than dust. Something was coming, and not just a storm. In town, talk had thickened like flies over spilt molasses. A man so large, so silent, living alone with two ragged children. It was bound to stir questions. Some whispered pity, some suspicion. The old storekeeper shook his head, saying he meant well, but folks wouldn't see it that way. The widow sharpened her words with honey, telling neighbors she was only concerned, though her eyes sparkled at the thought of scandal. What kindness he gave the girls! The town twisted into shadows. The twins felt it even from afar. They grew tense on the wagon rides into town, clutching his coat when stares followed them. Their small bodies stiffened whenever voices hushed around them. Yet on the ranch, where the world could not reach, something gentler grew. Each evening by the fire, their shoulders relaxed, their eyes softened. Slowly, trust rooted itself where only fear had lived before. One night, when the storm outside rattled the shutters and the air smelled of dirt and rain, the girl spoke. At first only fragments, whispered as if telling secrets too heavy for daylight. "We were like sparrows with broken wings," one said, staring into the flames. "Caged and starved until we learned not to sing," the other added, her voice trembling. Their words were not details, not confessions in the plain sense, but the shape of suffering carried in a child's broken poetry. They spoke of silence as survival, of bruises that taught them how to disappear, of hunger that gnawed louder than their cries. The giant listened without interruption. His rough hands rested on his knees, his face carved in shadow, eyes lowered as though the fire itself bore witness enough. When their voices fell quiet, he nodded once, solemn, carrying their truth as carefully as he had carried their sleeping bodies that first dawn. Later, when the girls had curled together and drifted into uneasy sleep, his past rose like a ghost. He walked out to the porch where the storm was breaking open, lightning cracking wide the sky. He remembered another storm years ago, when he had ridden for a doctor who never arrived in time. His wife had been too small, too fragile to bear the weight of new life. He had dug two graves side by side, one larger, one heartbreakingly small. Since then, the land had been his only company, silence his only companion, until now. And though it hurt to remember, he felt the faintest stitch of healing in the way those two frail girls had breathed softly by his fire. But healing always drew shadows. The first sign was a rider's track in the dust near the far fence. The second, a question asked too bluntly in town by a man who smelled of whiskey and anger, wondering if anyone had seen two girls wandering. The third, the way the twins stiffened at the mention of a name, their faces draining of color, their bodies folding in on themselves like wilted flowers. He came at dusk, a figure hunched and mean, eyes sharp with the kind of hunger that was not for food. His boots hit the ground heavy, his voice slurred yet sharp as he demanded what he claimed was his. The girls belonged to him, he said, blood bound them, and no giant of a man had the right to keep them. He did not speak of care, nor of love, only of possession, property, control. Inside the house, the girls shook, clutching each other, listening through the cracks in the walls. The rancher rose from his chair, the weight of his frame steady, unhurried. He stepped outside, the dust storm swelling at his back, his shadow thrown long across the yard. The man sneered, spitting words into the wind, but the rancher said nothing. His silence was not weakness, it was a wall immovable, carved from years of loss and toil. The girls slipped out the door, unable to stay hidden, their small hands finding the coarse fabric of his coat. They pressed against him, trembling, their eyes wide with the memory of nights they had fought to survive. He stood at the gate, his massive body blocking the path, the storm curling around him like a shroud. The cruel figure stepped forward, but the rancher did not move. He simply stood, tall and unyielding, while behind him the girls clung to him, as if he were the last safe place in the world. The storm roared louder, and the prairie seemed to hold its breath, knowing a reckoning had come. Dawn came slow, a pale wash of light spilling across the wide plain, turning the dust into gold. The ranch was quiet, but for the groan of the windmill and the soft nickers of the horses. The giant rancher sat on the porch, sharpening his axe with measured strokes, the rasp of stone against steel steady as breathing. When the edge gleamed, he set aside. It was not meant for killing. He had lived long enough to know that a man's strength was not in what he destroyed, but in what he protected. Still, courage often needed its own ritual, and the steel was his prayer. Inside the yard, the twins giggled faintly, the kind of laughter that always surprised him, light and fragile like birdsong after rain. They braided old ribbons into the mane of his horse, their small hands clumsy but full of care, unaware of the shadows stirring on the horizon. The rancher watched them for a moment, a rare softness loosening the stone of his face. Then his gaze shifted to the far hills where dust was rising, not from the wind, but from hooves. Riders. The earth trembled with their approach. He rose, his frame filling the doorway, and stepped out into the yard. The girls looked up, their ribbons still tangled in the horse's mane, sensing something shift in the air. The rancher's voice came low, steady. "Go inside. Stay low." They hesitated, fear flickering in their eyes, but the weight of his tone sent them running to the doorway. Still, they lingered where the shadows of the porch touched the ground, unwilling to leave him entirely. The riders came into view, hard men with hollow eyes, their faces cut with cruelty, their horses lathered from the ride. At their front was the figure from before, his sneer sharper now, his words already spilling like venom. He called for what he claimed was his, the children, spitting the word as if it meant nothing more than cattle. His voice cracked through the morning like a whip. The rancher did not move. His silence stretched long, a silence heavy as the mountains. And when he finally spoke, it was not loud but unshakable. "They are not yours." His voice carried the weight of earth itself, low and immovable. The men laughed, cruel and mocking. Words snapped back and forth, sharp as gunfire before bullets flew. They accused him, threatened him, tried to break him with numbers and rage. But the giant stood like a wall of stone, his broad shoulders squared, his boots rooted deep in the dust. Then the moment shattered. One of the men spurred his horse forward, gun drawn, the other circling. The rancher moved with the suddenness of a storm breaking, grabbing the bridle, yanking the rider down, the ground itself shaking under the impact. Fists, boots, grit, and desperation. It was not a drawn-out battle, but a clash raw and real, men struggling in the dust while the twins clung to the porch post, eyes wide with terror. The rancher's sheer strength turned the tide. He drove them back with nothing but his body and will. Every blow struck not for vengeance, but for defense. His hands were meant for mending fences, for lifting burdens, but now they held the weight of protecting the only fragile lives that had ever chosen him. At the height of the fight, when dust stung the air and the cruel men rallied to rush again, one of the girls broke from the porch. She stumbled forward, her small frame shaking, her voice quivering but fierce enough to pierce the chaos. "We are not afraid anymore. We belong here." The words rang out across the yard, sharp as any bullet. The men froze, caught off guard by the courage born from suffering. The rancher's chest rose with a breath that was more than breath. It was the sound of a man realizing he was no longer standing alone. The riders faltered. Their leader, bloodied and heaving, spat in the dirt but saw the truth. Not just in the rancher's stance, but in the children's defiance, in the bond that could not be broken by fists or threats. One by one, they turned their horses, retreating into the horizon, their cruelty scattering like dust in the morning wind. Silence fell. The dust settled. The giant rancher stood, chest heaving, his shirt torn, his hands raw. The twins ran to him, their small arms wrapping around his waist, clutching as if the world might still take him too. He sank to his knees, gathering them close, his massive arms trembling as they circled their thin shoulders. For the first time, his voice cracked, rough and tender all at once. "Daughters," he whispered, the word breaking free like water from stone. The girls wept, not from fear, but from the aching warmth of being wanted. Their tears stained his shirt, their small bodies pressed against the chest of a man who had long thought himself hollow. He held them as though holding the very reason to keep breathing. The prairie was wide and empty around them, the sun rising higher, burning the storm away. Yet within that quiet ranch, something eternal had been carved. Not from blood, but from choice. From standing when the world turned cruel. And if you listen close, you might still hear it whispered in the wind that sweeps across the plains. In the silence of the West, strength was never the fist that broke, but the hand that healed. And sometimes, family is not the one you're born into. It is the one you choose, and the one that chooses you, when all else has been lost.